Okay, so you should have done the independent practice from your last video, and let's look at that right here. And you can compare your answers to mine. The first one I'm looking, I've got a perfect square and a perfect square. I can't factor out any greatest common factor. This is subtraction, so this is difference of squares. It is x minus 8, x plus 8. Factoring 6x squared plus 15x. I'm looking at 6 and 15. Biggest number that'll go into both of those is 3. So I'm going to factor out a 3 there, and I've got x's and an x. So my greatest common factor on these two terms is 3x. I pull that out. Everything else must go back into parentheses. I have a binomial left, but it doesn't match a pattern of difference of squares, so that's as factored as that gets. I'm looking at the next one. I'm looking at 21, 7, and 7, and the biggest number that'll go into all three of those is 7. So I'm going to factor that into 7 times 3, 7 times 1, and 7 times 1. Then I'm looking at my x's. I have 3 there, I have 2 there, and I have 1 in my last term. So the thing I have in common in all three of these terms is a 7 and an x. So my greatest common factor is 7x. Everything else that I have not circled goes back into parentheses, and I get 3x squared plus x minus 1. This is a trinomial that we haven't really looked at, so we're going to leave that as is. Now this last one looks hard, but it really isn't. You just have to take it step by step. First look at your numbers, 5, 35, and 20, and the biggest number that will go into all of those is 5. So I'm going to factor that 5 out of each of those terms, and then on my first term I have 2 x's and a y. My second term I have an x and 2 y's, and my last term I have an x and a y. So what I have in common on all three of these terms is a 5, and then I have 1 y in each term and 1 x in each term. So my greatest common factor is 5xy. Everything else that I did not circle goes back in parentheses. So I have an x there, and I have a 7y on the second term left, and on the very last one I have minus 4. So hopefully you got the same things I did. Now the reason that we learned how to factor is because we want to learn how to solve quadratic equations, and we're going to use the process of factoring to do that with. So the first thing we're always going to do is factor out our greatest common factor. Then we're going to look at the number of terms in any remaining polynomial. If there are 2 terms, we're going to look for special products, the perfect square minus perfect square, or which we call the difference of squares. The 3 terms we're going to learn about in future concepts, but the thing we're adding on now is we're going to use these factors to solve the equation using a thing called the zero product property. And that is where we set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So the focus for this video is we're only going to be looking at quadratics that have 2 terms, or binomials. So now remember that the solutions of a quadratic equation are the x-intercepts, where it crosses the x-axis. So that is the value of x when y equals 0. Because on an x-intercept, y is always 0. So we have a thing called the zero product property that says if you multiply any 2 factors or any 2 numbers and it equals 0, then one of those factors or both have to be equal to 0. So if a times b equals 0, either a or b has to be 0. So we're adding in step 3 of the factoring solving process, which says after you have factored, solve by using the zero product property, which means that you set each factor equal to 0. But remember, you still always have to do step 1 and step 2. So let's look at this first one. It says x squared minus 64. Well, there's no greatest common factor that I can factor out of that, but I have a binomial. So I'm going to look at the number of terms, which is step 2, and it looks to me like I've got a perfect square minus a perfect square. So that is going to be difference of squares. So if I factor this, I'm going to get the factors x minus 8 times x plus 8. Those are my factors. And in Math Excel, if it says factor, that's what you would write down. But if it said solve, then I'm going to set each one of these factors equal to 0. I'm going to set x minus 8 equal to 0 and x plus 8 equal to 0, and I'm going to solve both of those equations. And I'm going to get x equals 8 and x equals negative 8. Those are my solutions. So if in Math Excel it says solve, it's looking for solutions, not factors. So be super careful. That can get confusing. Let's look at this second one. It says 6x squared plus 15x. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is factor out a greatest common factor, because between 6 and 15, I think I can take a 3 out of both of those. And then I've got two x's here and an x there. So what I have in common in these two terms is a 3 and an x. So 3x is my greatest common factor. Everything I have not circled has to go back in parentheses, and I get 2x plus 5. Well, I'm looking at 2x plus 5. It does not look like a difference of squares because there's no subtraction there. So if they said to factor, this is what I would enter. These are my factors. If it said to solve, I'm going to take each one of these factors, 3x, set it equal to 0, and 2x plus 5, and set it equal to 0, and I'm going to solve those. And I get x equals 0, and x equals negative 5 halves. Those are my solutions. So now you know how to factor. You factor out a greatest common factor. You look for the number of terms in the polynomial that is left, and the ones that you're going to be doing for this practice are only going to be binomials. Sometimes there'll be a difference of squares. Then if it says to solve, you're going to set each factor equal to 0 and solve it.